We'll give it maybe one more minute and we'll get started. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And we're excited to welcome you to this important session where we'll be diving into the latest updates on federal policy issues affecting nonprofits in 2025. Just as a FYI, we'll have to end this presentation a little earlier today than expected, and we know there are going to be a lot of questions, so please, if you can place them in the chat, and David, and this is being recorded, so we'll make sure that the recording will go out, and David will do his best to respond to the questions at a later date. So thank you, and it's my pleasure to introduce David, a respected advocate in the field of nonprofit policy. And as you all know, David brings a wealth of knowledge and experience, ensuring we are all informed and prepared to navigate the evolving policy landscape. So, David, you want to take it away?
Yes, thank you, Lisa, and good
Hmm.
morning to everybody. As Lisa said, we are recording this. I think I saw in their chat that somebody had their AI something turned on, so we ask that you turn that off. We don't want to kind of
Hmm.
don't want that active during the webinar. We're going to move kind of fast today. Unfortunately, I know we had scheduled it for an hour and a half, and we have a little bit less time than that to actually do it this morning. So we're going to kind of move quickly. If you have questions, go ahead and type them into the chat. I know that, thank you for those of you who ask questions in advance. And I think you all know who the center is. So the one thing that I want to emphasize at the beginning, there's a lot going on at the federal level, all branches of government, but we really want to encourage everybody not to panic. There are times maybe when you do need to, your organization will need to take actions in response to things. We'll talk a little bit about that, but we don't want you we don't want every nonprofit to panic simply because of some of the things that are happening. We're going to talk about executive branch policy developments and then some stuff going on in Congress this morning. What we're not talking about today are state policy issues. There's a separate webinar next Friday afternoon where we're going to talk more about state policy issues this year affecting nonprofits. So if you're tuning in for those, we will. I think most people have registered for both webinars. Quick context, I think most people are aware of this now, but Donald Trump is our president, and there's a slim Republican majority in both the US House. You see on the left of your screen there, Speaker Mike Johnson from Louisiana, and a narrow Republican, a 53-47 Republican majority in the US Senate. Senator John Thune from South Dakota is the new majority leader in the US Senate. The numbers of this in the Senate are significant because most bills, and we'll get to an exception that is in progress now, most bills need 60 votes to pass the Senate, which means that even with Republicans controlling the White House and both chambers of Congress, most legislation still needs some bipartisan support, at least in the Senate, to do that. First, we just want to give a quick kind of refresher on some basics because a lot of what we've seen more happening in the executive branch this year, and just kind of a reminder of what the executive branch is. I'm not going to read you this, but I put a few words from the U.S. Constitution just as a reminder that, and this is the basics of what you might have learned from your high school government class. If you remember that my daughter is taking government this semester in high school, and actually just took the AP exam a couple days ago, and so she's reminding me of all of this in real time. But the first article of the U.S. Constitution, and I apologize that I misspelled article there, but the first article of the Constitution gives the Congress really broad powers, kind of paraphrasing there in Section 8, but there's a lot of really specific things that Congress does. But most specifically, Congress has the power to pass laws that affect everybody, to um, to determine what the federal budget is and to appropriate money. That is the role of Congress, and also to figure out how the money is going to come in for the federal government. So to have a lot of influence over revenue and finance. Article 2 of the Constitution gives the president and the executive branch power. And it says the executive power, not the legislative power, the lawmaking or the appropriating power, but the executive branch powers in there. And then the rest of Article 2 gives the president powers, but it's pretty clear that the things that Congress is authorized to do are not the role of the president. I mentioned this because we've seen a lot of action from President Trump this year, and want to kind of highlight which ones, and there are also a lot of lawsuits challenging that. So kind of understanding, where maybe some of the things that he's done are either a little bit more limited than what we hear about in the press or in his press releases, and also why so many of them have been challenged in court, because a lot of it is at basics of the Constitution. So I know most of you probably did not go to law school and did not take administrative law, so I won't actually do a refresher, but I do want to just mention that there are kind of, and from the basics, three different types of executive actions that the executive branch, led by the president, can take. Regulations or rulemaking or where an agency, think the IRS, the U.S. Department of Labor, the Environmental Protection Agency, comes up with rules that are kind of within laws that Congress has passed. So they're not creating their own laws, but instead they are saying that Congress provided these laws, and maybe Congress said that then the IRS, the Department of Labor, or EPA can come up with some rules to kind of within those laws how it works. So when we think about a lot of things that are relevant to tax-exempt 501c3 organizations, a lot of that, some of that Section 501c3, and there's some other sections of the Internal Revenue Code that apply to us, but a lot of that isn't all spelled out in the statute, but instead Congress has deferred to the IRS and the Treasury Department to come up with regulations. Regulations are not something that can be done in a day. Some of you may remember the overtime rule that is now not in effect, but that the Biden administration had come out with. And it takes about 2 years from when a federal agency comes up with an idea of a regulation for it to actually go into effect. So it's not something that that on the first day in office, a new president can't just make new regulations or repeal other regulations. And those are, again, regulations are things that can be pretty broadly applicable across the country. Executive orders, and we've seen a lot of those. We're going to go into in a couple minutes the details of a few of those, are things that the president issues, and every president has issued them, has issued executive orders that are really directing federal agencies and the federal government how it operates. So it's not like broad laws, it's not applicable to everybody, but rather it's applicable, it's telling federal agencies that this is our policy for these agencies, or that we're going to do a certain thing, or we're going to create a certain office that has some administrative functions, but it's not broad lawmaking. And again, we're going to get into why there's some litigation around those executive orders. And then underneath those executive orders, a lot of times they don't have all the details in them. So different federal agencies will issue a memorandum that kind of provides details for how other agencies or how its employees of its agency will carry out that executive order. So we've seen those from the U.S. Department of Justice, recently from the Office of Personnel Management, from the Office of Management and Budget, and from the White House itself. So just kind of a refresher. And then again, there's been a lot that has been done through executive orders and memoranda, but also there has been a lot of litigation. So some numbers, as of yesterday, there were 140, President Trump in his second term had issued 147 executive orders, and there were 230 lawsuits challenging those. It is possible those were numbers I pulled yesterday afternoon. It is quite possible those numbers are higher now because executive orders are coming fast and furious, and likewise, court challenges to executive actions are coming quickly. I want to mention, and I'll mention this case again a couple other times. There is the U.S. Supreme Court, and you see the current justices there. Next week, next Thursday, is scheduled to hear oral arguments in a case regarding one of the first executive orders that President Trump issued in January about birthright citizenship. And we'll talk a little bit about the substance of that later, but the most significant thing for that to know is that the Trump administration's argument, one of their main arguments in the case is that there was the court that stopped the birthright citizenship executive order, issued a nationwide or universal injunction saying that across the country, CASA, which is a nonprofit, had sued the Trump administration of it. And it didn't just say that it doesn't apply to CASA and the people they serve, but it said that everybody in the country, that birthright citizenship is still something that is there, and is it could not be ended by an executive order. And the Trump administration is arguing that courts generally do not have the authority to issue broad, nationwide or universal injunctions, but really that injunctions should be a lot more limited to the parties of the case. And how the court rules on that, and we'll probably get a ruling from that in July, late June or early July from the Supreme Court. But how the Supreme Court rules on that case is going to be really significant for a lot of the other litigation that is challenging Trump executive orders, because if there's a precedent that, and I don't know which way the court will rule in that case. I don't know that, oral arguments are next week. Usually, based on what the questions that the justices ask and their comments during oral arguments, you can usually get a pretty good feel at that point where they're gonna where they're gonna come down on it. Justices Amy Barrett, Chief Justice Roberts, and Justice Kavanaugh are seen as kind of the three votes that could go either way in that case. But if the court were to rule that universal or nationwide injunctions are not something that are generally permissible, it really could stop some of the other litigation, or really limit the scope of it, and would require to have broader coverage, to have many more lawsuits, and every nonprofit that's affected by an executive order or an action would need to either sue individually or become part of a class action lawsuit. So that's why that's really significant. So we're going to get into some specific presidential actions affecting nonprofits. I think a lot of you have heard about this one. This is one of the first things that happened back in January. On a Monday afternoon, the Office of Management and Budget came out with a memorandum kind of interpreting several of the first executive orders that President Trump issued, that said, as of 5 p.m. tomorrow, we're freezing all federal funding, trillions of dollars of funds, including almost every federal grant to nonprofits was supposed to be frozen. Every federal agency was supposed to stop making disbursements, stop kind of managing anything, close their grant portals. And it, through the nonprofit sector, at least for organizations receiving federal funds, into a lot of chaos. There was immediately 2 lawsuits that were filed. There was actually a third lawsuit that was filed, one through the National Council of Nonprofits, and one by about 25 attorneys general from states, including Jeff Jackson, North Carolina's Attorney General. Both courts, the National Council of Nonprofits, one in DC, the AG's one in Rhode Island, issued nationwide injunctions stopping it. OMB at the same time withdrew the memorandum, but the courts then kind of followed up with their injunctions and said, not only do they need to, that specifically numbered memorandum, not only is that stopped, but OMB can't try to do anything similar with a broad federal funding freeze. So that's kind of where it is. It took a while for grant portals to reopen. It took some work in the courts. The plaintiffs in the cases still had to kind of work to get some other orders from the courts to force enforcement of that. But that's kind of where that was. There was a second executive order that came in February and was followed by a memorandum that directed DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, to look into, required every federal agency to look at every grant that it has. So not just every grant program, but every individual grant. And in doing so, figure out if there were things that were inconsistent with policies of the Trump administration. We'll get to some of those, but things related to if there was anything that was deemed discriminatory because it is related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, anything providing services to immigrants, anything that that veered from the policy of the Trump administration that there are only 2 sexes, male and female. Anything that was inconsistent with those was supposed to be flagged. And then there was in early March, I think it was signed at the end of February, published in the Federal Register first couple days of March, a follow-up executive order that directing DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, to have access to every federal grant, to go into every federal grant, and to start the process of revoking, terminating, or modifying grants that were deemed inconsistent with administration priorities. So that's kind of where things are on that. So that was Executive Order 14222. For those of you scoring at home, we'll try to do that. As a result of that executive order, a few weeks ago, DOGE took over the grants.gov website. And we've heard that there were some, at least for a day or so when that happened, some difficulties that nonprofits had accessing that website. So that's kind of where we are with funding freeze. AmeriCorps was a couple weeks ago was largely defunded. Most of the staff has been let go. Many of the AmeriCorps volunteers have had their terms terminated. There is litigation pending in court that was filed last week. As of yesterday, I don't know that there was an initial ruling on that. I've not had a chance to look this morning to see that would try issue an injunction trying to stop the dismantling of AmeriCorps. So we'll see what happens with that. Other actions related to funding last week, President Trump issued Executive Order 14290 that defunded National Public Radio and the public broadcasting system, two very large, prominent national nonprofits. There was an executive order about a month ago, EO 14275, the federal acquisition regulations, which are kind of the rules that not only for nonprofits for grants, but also for federal contractors that kind of set forth all the terms, many of the terms of your contracts, your ability to, if you were not treated fairly by a federal agency, if there's wrongful termination, giving you rights to do that. The executive order is directing all federal agencies and the Office of Management and Budget to rewrite the federal acquisition regulations. We don't know exactly what that will look like, but it is likely to happen fairly quickly, and that could have significant implications for nonprofits. The Inflation Reduction Act, a Biden era law in the bipartisan infrastructure bill that President Biden had kind of championed and signed into law, had a lot of grant programs, particularly related to clean energy, related to environmental protection, but related to other things too. And the Trump administration has taken action to defund those. There is litigation pending in court, and again, the National Council of Nonprofits is a party to that as well, seeking to stop those funding freezes as well, and the stop of those. And again, kind of the rationale for a lot of these lawsuits, and a lot of them are very similar in their rationale. Is first, we talked about a few minutes ago in the U.S. Constitution, the separation of powers, that it is Congress's job to appropriate funds, not the president's. So the president can't just not follow Congress's direction for how to spend, how money is appropriated. And then also that the Administrative Procedures Act, which is a federal law that kind of governs how federal agencies make rules, how they operate, and what their authority is. Then a lot of this is in direct violation of various provisions in that. So that's kind of the impetus for a lot of the legal challenges to things. And then the other one that's pending in court, and there was a second lawsuit filed this week by attorneys general, not including Jeff Jackson, but I think there were 20 or so state attorneys general who were part of it. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services has seen a significant reduction in spending. So they've kind of cut spending for a lot of programs, including a lot of programs going to states, including millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars to North Carolina, and have also consolidated their very large bureaucracy into fewer agencies, which has created, when done so quickly, has created a lot of challenges related for healthcare organizations and healthcare and people related, who benefit from those. So the attorneys general and others have challenged that is really dismantling of the Department of Health and Human Services, and have asked courts to issue an injunction stopping that. Going to shift gears to a couple of the executive orders related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Two of these were some of the first things that were issued by President Trump, EO 14151 and 14773 were two of the early executive orders issued by President Trump in January. They kind of broadly ended DEI programs in federal agencies, and that's been largely in effect. That largely happened pretty quickly. That if there were offices within federal agencies that were DEI offices or staff who were tasked with things that are related to DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, that those were terminated, requiring federal, and so kind of setting the federal policy that anything not just using the terms diversity, equity, inclusion, but is really providing, that are things that are consistent with that, are things that are considered discrimination. So anything that is favoring, providing differential treatment to people based on their race or sex, is seen as something that is discriminatory and is inconsistent with federal policy. So requiring federal grantees and contractors to attest that they will comply with those federal anti-discrimination laws, and then encouraging private sector employees to end their DEI programs. And we've seen some big businesses that have ended their DEI programs because of that. Again, as we talked about at the beginning, executive orders are something that apply to government agencies. They can, to some degree, apply to government grantees and contractors as well, but not something that can, Congress tells private sector, actors what to do. And then there was another executive order issued a couple weeks ago, EO 14281, that would eliminate the use of disparate impact liability by federal agencies. And what that means is kind of a legal theory that says that if there's a law that doesn't say we're providing preferential treatment based on race, but the impact is that the people are more likely to benefit from it if they're a minority, or if they're based on their gender or their LGBTQ status, that even though it doesn't say race, sex, LGBTQ, that is still something that because it benefits people differently. So those could be things that benefit low income people that maybe benefit certain races more than others, are something that executive order says that federal agencies can't use. As a result of that, we've seen in just a couple, screenshots, and I don't try to read those, that various federal agencies, and a lot of them have sent notices to their grantees telling them that they need to make sure that they don't have DEI policies. There was an injunction issued, a nationwide injunction issued, stopping the first two of those executive orders. But then an appellate court reversed that decision, and so those executive orders are still in place. So even though there was initially a nationwide injunction, that injunction is no longer in place. There was last week, maybe in this beginning of this week, early May, there were some additional filings by the plaintiffs to try to get those injunctions reinstated on different grounds. And the trial court said, no, we got to stick with what the appellate court says for now. So that is still pending. This could still be stopped in court. A couple of examples of how this has been impacted. So you see a picture of downtown Asheville there. When Asheville the city of Asheville, in addition to the state of North Carolina, received significant FEMA funding as a result of Hurricane Helene. They're in like 80 or 100 pages of their proposal for how they were going to spend that funding. There was one line in there for a small business program that said that it would provide support to minority-owned businesses minority and women-owned businesses, among other. And because of that, FEMA said, we have rejected your application because that one line is something that we see as DEI, and DEI is dead in FEMA is what they said in their response. So Asheville amended that, took out that line, and they did get their FEMA funding approved. But just as a note that federal agencies are really anything that is seen as DEI are not going to fund it right now. So if you have federal funds and you've got programs that are related to DEI. First, stay informed. As I mentioned, that litigation, is ongoing. While the executive orders are in effect now, that could change as that moves through the court system. And there could be additional legal challenges on different grounds to try to, to get those stopped again. Likewise, if a federal agency that is your granting agency provides you direction on what to do, follow that. But otherwise, probably don't overreact and don't make changes to what you're doing, your practices, your policies, what your website says, until it is really clear that you need to. But it's important to understand, if you haven't already done this, to do some due diligence of your own programs to see things that might be deemed DEI, recognizing that, the executive orders are pretty clear that the intent is what matters, rather than what the words. So even if you don't use the words diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I've heard that there's a growing list of words that are no words in federal government that is several dozen words long, maybe up to closing in on 100 words, I think, that are kind of fit within diversity, equity, inclusion that are causing red flags for federal agencies. So just be aware of that. What about DEI programs, initiatives, or practices if your nonprofit doesn't have federal grants or contracts? So as I said, the president through executive action can't just tell private sector employees you have to stop your DEI programs. And Congress hasn't passed any law and is not likely to, because again, it would require bipartisan support in the U.S. Senate. So Congress hasn't passed anything that bans DEI in the private sector. So again, with the disclaimer that this is not legal advice, MC Hammer would say you can't touch this. That's not something that there's really authority to do. But, and this is a big but, as Sir Mix-a-Lot might say, the reality is that federal agencies are starting to figure out ways that they can do it. So about a month and a half ago, the EEOC, the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, came out with 2 fact sheets aimed at employees to let them know, first, that that they do have rights to, and how they can take legal action against their employers if they are, if they have DEI programs that have harmed them. And the theory that EEOC has and that the Department of Justice are using for this is that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which obviously was not designed primarily to protect white males, but that it prevents any type of discrimination based on race or sex, and if there are things that are disproportionately benefiting anybody because of their race or sex, any employment policies, that those are things that are the EEOC sees as illegal discrimination. So there could be legal challenges to your organization, even if you don't have federal grants and policies, if you've got employment practices that are doing that. And again, I'm not necessarily suggesting that organizations need to remove any policies that they have related to DEI, but just be aware of the potential for that liability and the potential to have a complaint filed either with the EEOC or in court by an employee if they feel like they were discriminated against because you were providing better treatment to people based on their race or sex or other classifications. So that's kind of where we are on that. The next executive action, and this is one that hasn't happened yet, but has been in the news a lot and has been threatened by President Trump a couple times. You see Harvard University there. President Trump has twice posted on social media in the last 2.5 weeks that he is either contemplating or in the process of trying to revoke Harvard University's tax-exempt status. Harvard is one of the biggest and oldest 501c3s in the country. The grounds for that are basically that Harvard has a lot of policies that are seen as diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that are inconsistent with the Trump administration's priorities. And Harvard is, unlike some other schools, Harvard is not backing down from that. They've already lost $2 billion in federal funds for that. They've already sued the Trump administration in litigation that's pending. There have also been, there was a rumor that on Earth Day, there were going to be executive orders targeting the tax exemption or revoking tax exemption of many environmental organizations. and potentially other nonprofits, potentially Harvard as well, but other progressive organizations. That didn't actually happen. It is something it is actually there's a very clear process in federal tax law and the IRS rules for revoking tax exempt status. It is not something the president can generally do, or not something the president can direct the IRS to do. And traditionally, the IRS has been very independent and is not, has not been, a highly political organization. So it would be a pretty big shift for the IRS to just revoke tax exempt status because the Trump administration says that. But there was a media report in the Wall Street Journal last week that there have been a lot of discussions between the White House, the Department of Justice, and the Treasury Department about either providing heightened scrutiny to nonprofits and the tax exempt status of nonprofits that are inconsistent with Trump administration priorities, or there was a request from another nonprofit to review and revoke the tax exempt status of 3 private foundations that because they had grant making programs that had criteria that were seen as tied in with diversity, equity, and inclusion. So far, nothing has come of that. I mean, the one thing I'll say is one of those 3 was the Gates Foundation, which announced this week that it is over the next 20 years winding down operations, but I don't think it's related to that. But for what it's worth, that's what's there. The justification for these, both from the Trump administration and from the nonprofit that has challenged other organizations' tax exempt status, are a couple of things. And I'll start with the bottom. That the Trump administration is suggesting that that doing things that are inconsistent with its priorities should not be granted tax exempt status. There has been a suggestion that certain things, including things like mentioning climate change, would be deemed as terrorist activities, and that could be something if it is directly a terrorist activity that could lead to revocation of tax exempt status. But that would be a stretch, and certainly one that would be challenged in court. And then third, and probably the one that is kind of the most interesting argument, one that is quite a stretch, but is there in 1983 the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the IRS could revoke and did revoke the tax exempt status of Bob Jones University because it had a whites only policy, and the rationale was that kind of violated fundamental public policy of our country, and that that you can't get tax exempt status if you're doing something that is just kind of seen as almost universally against what is our policy direction of our country. And the thinking, again, kind of tying into that third bullet down there, is that the Trump administration is suggesting, and others are suggesting, that there is a clear policy that anything DEI is something that is discriminatory and illegal, and that a nonprofit that is doing that is violating fundamental public policy of the country. Likewise, that providing services to immigrants is something that would be violating the fundamental public policy of the country. Again, to me, at least, that's quite a stretch to suggest that, and would be kind of unprecedented. But I think we will continue to see the potential for threats to the tax exempt status of some nonprofits. Again, with the reminder, don't panic. The reality is it's probably going to be the highest profile and biggest organizations who are who are the first targets. They will certainly fight it in court. Our national network and the center are we'll do everything we can to be fully supportive. So be aware of it. I think that there are really strong arguments against revocation of tax exempt status, based on policy things that are questionable at best and are kind of new in the Trump administration, but that's where we are. Next set of executive actions, we've got ALPHA in there because they talk about illegal aliens, but we'll maybe use the term undocumented people here as we're talking. But there are several immigration-related executive orders. The first one, as I mentioned, would end birthright citizenship. It's a long-standing principle that is, I think most lawyers would suggest is embedded in the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, that if you're born in this country, you're a U.S. citizen. And that was a pretty big, back in January, a pretty big policy change. Again, one that is currently stopped in court, but is pending that court decision that I mentioned before in the U.S. Supreme Court. Another executive order prohibiting the access to federally funded programs by those who are undocumented. Again, that could have significant impact on nonprofits who are serving immigrant populations. That if you're serving people who are undocumented, there could be, they could be losing services, and the potential is there for federal agencies to overreach a little bit and to take action to revoke funding or to, other action against nonprofits that are providing federal services to those people. So again, one to be aware of if you fall into that category, but not necessarily unless you're told you need to do something to take action on. And then there was an executive order last week ending federal funding for sanctuary jurisdictions, which is sort of kind of defined in the executive order. It is, and those are cities or counties or towns that are not cooperating with ICE and not, kind of following federal immigration law as it's interpreted by the administration. It is unclear whether or which North Carolina cities might be deemed sanctuary cities, but it would end federal funding for them. So just be aware that if you are operating in a place that does the Trump administration deems a sanctuary city, you could, there could be some threat to funding streams for your area. And that can have a trickle down effect on nonprofits as well. A couple executive orders on faith activities. One of the early ones established the White House Faith Office, which actually, the way it was worded, it seems like that it is looking to really, cooperate with and invest federal funds in faith-based and community organizations. What comes of that, and it has a prominent location, I've been told, within the White House, and actually the White House, kind of the basement of the White House building itself, rather than in the executive office building across the street. So, perhaps has some impact. And then there was another executive order last week creating a religious liberty commission that would do a variety of things and could be used as an impetus to kind of politicize faith-based nonprofits. So we'll talk in a few minutes about the longstanding law that C3 nonprofits can't support or endorse candidates, and kind of the wording of creating that commission is looking at perhaps pushing for Congress or to pass a law, or the IRS just to ignore the current law that would enable faith-based nonprofits to engage in partisan politics, which we'll talk about in a bit is problematic. Some other executive orders: public service loan forgiveness program which benefits nonprofits. There were some limitations on that in Executive Order 14236. So that's the program that President George W. Bush signed into law, and President Biden has really made actually work well. This says that if you work in a public service job, including with a C3 nonprofit, for 10 years, you get the rest of your federal student loans forgiven. That executive order, which is still in effect, says that environmental organizations don't count for that, and organizations providing services to immigrants don't count for that. So, that could be problems for younger employees who are working for you, who are part of the PSLF program. Likewise, and also problematic, as part of the dismantling of the U.S. Department of Education, the Public Service Loans Forgiveness Program and other student loan programs were transferred to the Small Business Administration, which has no expertise or background in managing student loan programs. So there's going to be some hiccups in that program moving forward. There was another executive order that kind of broadly directs federal agencies to look at repealing a lot of federal regulations. Things related to safety, health, environmental protection are all at risk of being repealed. So that's another thing that is potentially going to make some significant changes moving forward. And it as part of that, it also and again, this will likely be challenged as violating the Administrative Procedures Act, but I mentioned that it's generally a 2-year process to create or repeal a regulation. It directs federal agencies to kind of skip that process and just go ahead and do it, even though that's not the way Congress has laid it out for them to do. So we'll see what happens on that. There was an executive order from a few weeks ago, EO 14248, that it was stopped last week in court that would require documentary proof of citizenship to vote. And that, a lot of voting rights organizations had significant concerns about that. One note of that, and this didn't really have any impact, but there was really misleading language on it that suggested that it is illegal for 501c3 nonprofits to lobby, and that's not accurate, but it was kind of written in there, and it was just as an afterthought almost, but was in there. And yeah, so I mentioned again that that case pending before the Supreme Court, will have a big impact on um, preliminary, and whether injunctions can be nationwide. And then in addition to that, and this is one that courts have mostly laughed at and ignored, but the White House sent a memo to all federal agencies saying that you need to seek a bond and require any plaintiff in a lawsuit challenging the Trump administration to have courts require a bond to get any type of injunction. So like the National Council of Nonprofits case, the argument would be there are several, $2 or $3 trillion of federal funds there. So the National Council of Nonprofits and the other plaintiffs would need to put out $2 or $3 trillion to be able to file a lawsuit, and that effectively makes it impossible for way too costly for any organization to be able to get a bond to back that up and to take on that liability. And like I said, courts have just basically ignored that memo and said that's ridiculous, and that there's not really any precedent for that. I know that's a lot on the executive branch. We are, and if there are, I am not in the chat, but I know others from the center are. Feel free to shout out if there are questions about that. But in the meantime, we're going to kind of shift over, and don't forget about Congress. There's a lot that's going there. We kind of talked about the makeup for Congress. And the biggest thing, Congress's biggest priority for this year is the big beautiful bill, is what President Trump has called it, but it is the budget reconciliation. And I mentioned that most bills need 60 votes to pass the US Senate, but once or twice a year, Congress can get a bill through that just is really a spending bill and a tax bill that only requires 50 votes in the US Senate. And there's a whole kind of dance that the US House and the US Senate have to do back and forth to get it to work. They're about a third of the way through that dance. They've kind of agreed on the rules for the bill, kind of, sort of, and what it would look like. And now they're working out the details for it. This is something you usually see when the White House and both chambers of Congress are of the same party. So 2010, the Affordable Care Act was passed through budget reconciliation. 2017, the first Trump administration, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was passed through budget reconciliation. 2022, the Inflation Reduction Act, President Biden got through budget reconciliation. So that's kind of the big focus on it. Most of the tax cuts from 2017 are set to expire after this year. The vast majority of those are something that everybody in Congress from both parties supports. So it's not like most of those are controversial, but there are some that only have Republican support. But so a big priority is just extending those, making them permanent. And the US Senate used a kind of a Jedi mind trick. That's why we see Obi-Wan Kenobi here with his Jedi mind trick. These are not the droids you're looking for. That said, these are not the tax cuts you're looking for. They were going to make them permanent, it would cost trillions of dollars of federal revenue. And what the US Senate said is, we're just going to pretend that it doesn't cost anything to make them permanent. So that way we're not adding to the deficit. It doesn't really make it that way, but it makes it so that they can, if the part of the rules that they're trying to follow for budget reconciliation are not adding to the federal deficit, so that they can do the tax cuts without having to make quite as many spending cuts to offset it. Spending cuts are definitely a huge part of that, of the budget reconciliation process now. There are several committees in Congress that are working through those. The Trump administration would like to see across the board cuts to domestic spending, and some increase in spending for Homeland Security and for Department of Defense. So it would require even bigger cuts to pay for some of the tax cuts that would be there. Some of the specific things that could be in there, the child tax credit that was expanded in 2017, and that a lot of nonprofits have said has really benefited the people they serve. President Biden for a year extended in Congress extended it as part of the Inflation Reduction Act even further. But the kind of expanded child tax credit was part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. I think that's something that is likely to be in the final bill. Potentially revocation of tax exempt status for certain for nonprofit hospitals or for other nonprofits could be a part of that as a way of raising revenue by making them pay taxes. Increasing endowment taxes on which were set at 1.4% for university endowments to like 14 to 21%, is on the table to bring a lot more revenue. Would have a huge impact on probably 3 colleges in North Carolina: Duke, Davidson, and Wake Forest, but also would have a trickle-down effect because they would need to do a lot more private fundraising, kind of competing with other nonprofits for other types of fundraising if their endowments are taxed more to raise more money. Potentially revoking the tax exempt status of nonprofit hospitals, which again would have a huge trickle-down effect on the sector. Potentially requiring payout requirements or additional taxes on foundations or donor advised funds. A lot is potentially in there. It is rumored that the early next week that we will see some of the details of what that tax legislation might look like. And then the spending cuts, again, almost everything that could affect nonprofits in the federal budget is likely to be cut. The most significant thing, and you'll see in our policy update today, we've got a little bit more detail on it, are changes to Medicaid. And that's something that has been really debated a lot, kind of behind closed doors among Republicans in Congress in the last few weeks. If in North Carolina, we've had Medicaid expansion that we've had in place for a year and a third now, that has brought 650,000 additional North Carolinians onto gotten them health coverage through Medicaid. If that were to go away, and if currently the federal government pays for 90% of the cost of Medicaid expansion coverage, if that number is reduced, that automatically goes away. 650,000 North Carolinians lose their health coverage. That is something that has been talked about because it would create a big cost savings. Also, making other changes to payments that would require the states to effectively pay a lot more for Medicaid or would remove people from Medicaid rolls, again, has huge trickle-down effects for the state that are and for healthcare providers and for every nonprofit, because it is going to mean that there are so many more people who are not getting adequate healthcare and who are going to need other services from nonprofits. So that's really significant. The things that are likely to be a part of that are work requirements for Medicaid. It seems like that's something that has already kind of been agreed on as something that would be added that could limit some of who's in Medicaid, who's receiving Medicaid benefits. But that the reality is that Medicaid is one of the biggest federal programs, so the one where there can be the most cost savings with significant cuts, but also one that there are some Republicans who are moderate or who are in kind of swing districts or who are in places, rural places where a lot of people are on Medicaid who really are opposed to big Medicaid cuts. So not an easy thing to do. And again, just because the same party controls both chambers, they've got narrow majorities, and getting a majority of both chambers in there is going to be difficult. Separate from that, so the budget reconciliation is kind of looking at big picture moving forward, that we're going to make these cuts moving forward. Congress also, the government is funded in a continuing resolution through the end of the fiscal year, September 30th, but Congress also needs this year to pass a new budget for the year starting October 1st and going through next September 30th. So last week, President Trump, the first step in that process is the president comes out with his budget proposal. He sent that to Congress last week. He's proposing a 22.6% reduction in discretionary non-defense spending. That essentially means eliminating or significantly reducing basically every federal program that is relevant to nonprofits. That doesn't mean that's going to happen. Regardless of who's president, who's in Congress, who's leading in Congress, Congress ignores the president's proposal, but it is, what's out there. Congress will do their own thing. But just know that there are likely to, almost certain to be some spending cuts in the next budget. And for those of you who've seen the movie Pulp Fiction, you remember the opening and closing scene where they're in the diner and everybody be cool, this is a robbery. And then the next line is, I think, we're taking your nonprofits donations and giving them to our favorite politicians. So there's a bill in Congress. I think it may have been something slightly more profane in the actual movie than that. Yeah, so kind of taking from nonprofits. I alluded to this before, but there is a bills in both houses of Congress. Congressman Mark Harris from North Carolina is the primary sponsor of the House bill called the Free Speech Fairness Act. This is a bill that would effectively, as you all probably know, Section 501c3 that covers all of us says that we have to be nonpartisan. We can't support or oppose candidates for office. This would say that we can, and that you can endorse candidates, and that's a huge problem for nonprofits. You know, then a little bit on my soapbox here, but it is something that would really harm the nonprofit sector because there would be an expectation that the donors would want to give to C3 nonprofits because they can get a tax write-off for it potentially. Foundations might want to give to you so that you can spend your money not on your programs and services, but on campaign ads, for or against their favorite candidate for office, and on independent expenditures for that. That would be a huge problem. It would really divert money from our programs and services to that. Likewise, it creates a lot of pressure to do what our elected officials want us to do. So if your nonprofit, gets a grant from your town, and your mayor is running for reelection, and says, "Look, if you want to keep getting your grant from us, you really need to endorse my campaign." Or city council members say that, and it can really put pressure on organizations to have to do things and to spend money not for programs and services, but rather for partisan politics. I don't think it'll ultimately pass. Again, it's a bill that probably has to get bipartisan support, which it doesn't have. But just letting you know that's out there. There are some good bills out there in Congress, and these are all bipartisan bills. The Charitable Act would create a universal non-itemizer deduction for charitable contributions, would significantly increase charitable giving, has bipartisan support. Senator Budd is one of the sponsors of the Senate bill. Congressman Don Davis is a sponsor of one of the sponsors of Democrat is one of the sponsors of the House bill. Congresswoman Deborah Ross has been a big supporter. That's another Democrat. Has bipartisan support. I know Congressman Edwards has said that he is supportive of this as well, a Republican. Even though it has a lot of broad bipartisan support, it does cost a lot of money, so it probably won't pass. The budget reconciliation bill would be, the vehicle for that. And the reality is, it seems like the tax cuts, other types of tax cuts, are prioritized over increasing charitable giving. But doesn't mean that we all aren't advocating for it at the nonprofit sector. Another bill I think it's bipartisan. There are definitely Republicans on it. I think there are some Democrats on it. That is a good bill in both the House and the Senate, is the Safeguarding Charities Act. And this is kind of following up on some lawsuits that have been filed in recent years that are alleging that tax exempt status for a C3 organization is a federal benefit. And because of that, it means that nonprofits fall under other federal laws that would, even if they don't have federal funding, that apply to those with federal funding. So it would kind of increase the scope of legal liability for nonprofits. And this bill kind of expressly says that tax exempt status is not a federal benefit in and of itself. Says something, the center is supportive of that. We think it makes a lot of sense, and would kind of respond to some kind of rogue court decisions that have, challenged, made nonprofits subject to, kind of treated like government agencies for things. The Volunteer Driver Appreciation Act would just bring up the mileage rate that your volunteers can get from 14 cents a mile to the current federal rate, which is over 60 cents a mile. Something that we've been advocating for a long time, has bipartisan support, and just doesn't get much attention. And then finally, the Retirement Fairness for Charities and Educational Institutions Act is just kind of fixing a federal employment law that was passed a couple years ago for small businesses that excluded nonprofits from being eligible for certain retirement programs. So it would just be kind of a fix for that. I think it's non-controversial and has bipartisan support. There are also some bad bills in Congress. The Fence Act would revoke tax exempt status for organizations serving immigrants. Not likely to pass. Putting Trust and Transparency Act is a recently filed bill that would say that federally funded nonprofits need to make their Schedule B, which is a list of donors, available to the public, and would actually revoke the tax exempt status of any nonprofit with federal funding if you don't file the Schedule B. It would be an automatic revocation process, kind of like the automatic revocation process for not filing a 990 for 3 straight years. So I don't think it'll pass, but you know, is out there. The Safeguarding Charities Act is a good bill. I mentioned that before. SAVE Act is kind of putting into law the you know, what I mentioned before in the executive order about requiring documentary proof of citizenship. It has passed the U.S. House, but doesn't likely have the votes to pass the Senate. The Judicial Relief Clarification Act would again, and the No Rogues Ruling Act are two different bills, but essentially putting into law that Supreme Court case is going to be held next week and would say that the lower courts cannot issue nationwide or universal injunctions. So these are some things that could be problematic. And I know that was a lot quickly. If we've got a couple of questions, we can take those. We do need to wrap up in a minute or two, but if there are a couple of common questions, we can do those. We will also be kind of monitoring the questions that were in the chat and in a follow-up email. We'll probably wait till Monday to send a follow-up email to everybody who was here with the link. But if there are questions that we did not address today, get those. So.
Yes, thank you. We have
Sarah,
the
Rebecca, were there any common questions that we got in the chat that we need to address?
Actually, no, David, no questions. You were very thorough, and I think everybody was listening with hyper ears. So no questions at the moment.
Great. Well, thank you for everybody for being here today. As I mentioned, we've got a separate webinar next Friday. It's in the afternoon next Friday on state policy developments affecting nonprofits. If most of you have already registered for that, but if you haven't, wherever you saw the registration for this, the registration for that was there as well.
Yep. Thank you all. We appreciate you joining us today. And please continue to stay connected through our weekly policy updates and advocate for the causes that matter most to your organization. Hope you all have a great day.